your time to cross the Red Sea is now. So come on over. So is everyone in? All right, guys, I think everyone's in from the waiting room now. I want to welcome you to the first Cannabis Law Society event for fall 2020. My name is August Bonacci. I'm a 2L. I'm the president of CLS, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you, and especially our newest executive board members. We've got some 1L students who just joined us, so it's really exciting to see this club growing. But today, it's my pleasure, and even more exciting, to welcome two distinguished speakers, Mr. Matt Abel and Mr. Margeaux Bruner. I'm going to introduce them in a moment, but first I want to just lay out a roadmap for our presentation today. We're going to be talking about the past, the present, and the future of cannabis. We're going to be using history as a foundation for discussion of the business of cannabis, and it's my hope that this first event lays a foundation for the rest of our exciting year and our semester. So a real quick overview. We're talking about the past and pre-prohibition. That's going to take us back more than 10,000 years to humans' first contact with this wonderful plant. We're going to talk about prohibition, which really begins in the early 20th century in America, and which is still largely in effect, and at least its pernicious legacy is still largely in force. And then we're going to be talking about post-prohibition possibilities, opportunities for an equitable future for this industry. And today, our focus is how the past can help us create an equitable future for this industry. And a note that this event is going to be recorded. It's going to be posted on Facebook. So to all your friends who couldn't make it, that they are not going to miss out on this wonderful content. So as I mentioned, our two panelists are Mr. Matt Abel and Ms. Margeaux Bruner. Each has, I think, too many titles to enumerate. They're each involved in the industry, not only as professionals, but also as advocates for law and policy reform. So we're graced to have this wealth of knowledge with us. And I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves briefly, tell us how you got involved in the cannabis industry and why. Tell us a little bit about your path to your current position. So how about, let's have Margeaux go first and just kind of give us the background, who you are, where you're coming from.
Hello, Margeaux Bruner. I am the Director of Compliance and Diversity Inclusion for Mid-American Growers / Red, White, and Bloom. And I am also on the Board of Directors for the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And I'm also a consultant with Perpetual Harvest, which is my own consultancy. And I came to this industry roughly maybe 4 years ago. At that time, I was a project manager. Historically and traditionally, my background was in automotive supply chain, benchmarking, you name it. And I was just kind of bored there. And I was watching a show called Weedakit, and there was an episode called The Mary Janes. And they were talking about an organization called Women Grow. And Women Grow is a networking organization. It was beginning at that point. They had a number of chapters. And I was just really kind of curious, because they were saying how there were more women on par, they have more C-suite positions in this new industry. And I was just completely curious. And so I went to work and I bought a ticket to Denver because at that point in time, Michigan, we're in a quasi-legal state. So we had the compassionate caregiver model. We had not adopted seed to sale. We did have storefront dispensaries. We call them provisioning centers in the state of Michigan. But they weren't operating at the level that I knew they would need to in the future. So I really wanted to see what an advanced market looked like. And so I went to Denver, Colorado. And then while I was in Denver, I met a number of people that I met on things from Meetup and LinkedIn. And I signed up for an event called resume writing in the cannabis industry. And resume writing was something that I did at the time, kind of on the side. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting thing to do. And what it actually was a meeting of the Denver Women's Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. And so I met a number of people there from all facets of the industry. And I was just kind of curious then, like, well, where is this tribe in Michigan? And at that time, the Detroit chapter of Women Grow was launching actually in the basement of Matt's office. Like, I met Matt very, very early into my journey here. I went on to become a market leader for Women Grow. I became a commissioner for the Michigan State Police Impaired Driving Committee. We conducted a 13-month study on what is impairment / per se impairment for cannabis. And it was different in that it was the first of its kind in that we did not recommend a per se limit. The presence of THC in your bloodstream does not necessarily indicate that you are impaired, and that unlike a number of other things like alcohol, I could potentially consume cannabis today and it would still be in my bloodstream 30 days from now. I went on to be part of the Coalition to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol, Proposal 1, which brought adult use legalization to the state of Michigan. I was a member of Attorney General Dana Nessel's Marijuana Policy Work Group, the former political director for the Michigan Cannabis Industry Association, and I've done a number of equity-related things in this space, founding member of National Expungement Week. I also have done like some social equity work when it comes to municipalities and ordinances. So I've kind of gotten to see the full gamut on both sides, and that I do quite frequently work with social equity applicants. And I also am employed by an MSO. So I kind of get to see the full gamut of what the industry is right now. And when it comes to policy in the state of Michigan, I've had the opportunity to kind of like bring adult use legalization to the state of Michigan and then walk alongside it and see how it evolved and was interpreted, because the law is a very living thing. On the campaign and as part of the initiative, there were certain things that we interpreted as a particular way. And then when we got in a room full of attorneys and judges, a completely different interpretation. So it's interesting to see the law kind of come into its own in that way.
Margeaux, thank you so much for those words. There's a lot of knowledge there, and we're going to be calling on all of that as we move into our program. So Matt, please go ahead and just give us a little bit of background about you. How did you get involved in the industry, and how did you get to where you are today in front of your law office there and your virtual background?
Right. It was really great to hear Margot's introduction. She seemed to me, when I first met her, like she knew a lot about marijuana. So kudos to you, Margeaux. I had no idea that, and meeting at my office in the beginning in the basement in the building pictured behind me. It's a place I've had for 12 years now in Detroit. I was lucky enough to be able to get this real estate before Detroit was cool, if that's true. And so the law firm is upstairs. On the first floor is a yoga studio and a doctor's office that writes medical marijuana recommendations. And in the basement is a pool table and a room where we used to, before COVID, had monthly Motor City Normal meetings. And as Margeaux said, there were Women Grow meetings there for a time, at least one or a couple, and other groups. So my history, I'm 61 years old. I made my hobby a job, a career. I have been a lawyer over 30 years. So when I started as a marijuana consumer, smoking in high school. It's funny because I thought we were smoking the leaves. I didn't even know that the plant flowered. You know, we would get what we call brown Mexican weed that was half seeds, and you would take a double record album, vinyl, if you know what that is, and some of them open up and you'd take one and let all the seeds roll out. So what was left is what you could smoke. So I've been a consumer since I was 15, and anybody who tells you it makes you dumb and stupid and lazy, the answer is, well, no, only the people who get in trouble are the ones who are visible, who might be any of those things or not, just got caught in a bad situation. I've been busted before too. Someday I'll tell you that story. But it's not something that most people are out about. So there's been a very, it's been very much in the closet for a long time. I'll tell you well, I'll come to advocacy. Okay. I was in Representative Dingell's office in DC a couple of years ago advocating, and she met us, 5 of us from the Midwest, unscheduled. We were scheduled to meet one of her staff, and she ended up bringing us into her inner office and said out loud that it makes you dumb and lazy and stupid. And so at that point, I really outed myself, and I didn't really go there with that purpose. I didn't think we were going to meet her anyway. But when she said that craziness, I told her that I have 4 college degrees. I'm an Eagle Scout. I've been practicing law for over 30 years. Right now, I'm the chair of the marijuana law section of the State Bar of Michigan. And I've been on the Representative Assembly of the State Bar for 20 years off and on. And that the reason why she has that impression is that she only sees people who get in trouble from it. And she had there was some drug abuse in one of her relatives, and she had a really bad feeling about it. And so it's interesting because that day I moved her from hell no to no. And you don't move somebody from hell no to yes overnight. It's incremental. And the incredible thing to me is that a year or 2 later, she ended up speaking at Hash Bash, which it is in her district at the University of Michigan, and it's a liberal environment, and she is a moderately liberal Democrat, but that was a long way for her to go from hell no to actually saying that, the laws were a problem. So let me brag a little bit more about myself if I can. So I told you I've been a consumer since I was 15. I clerked and had various legal jobs from that time on. But when I got out of law school, I did a lot of court-appointed work. I did whatever I could do. Well, actually, I started at a very small firm, and I did real estate, probate, divorce, and it ended up being really helpful later now, the real estate background that I gained then and the small business background, because I ended up being a criminal defense lawyer and then specializing in marijuana cases because that was the only leverage I had, the only way to fight the system and to change the law. It was always, for me, it always is about changing law. And still have federal to go. Even if you live in a legal state, there's still a long way to go. And so I had some friends who gave me office space. I was lucky enough to be able to develop a cannabis-only criminal defense practice because that was the only kind of marijuana law there was then. People were getting busted for it. That was about it. And misdemeanors and felonies. And so the lawyers who told me I was nuts and crazy to do that nickel-dime stuff when I was, young lawyer, ended up years later telling me that I was a freaking genius. And I'm like, timing is everything. And I was just following my heart. I didn't do it. And I didn't get rich doing it. I didn't do it for the money. And it wasn't the marijuana that bought the building behind me. It was family assets and conniving and being in the right place, the right time. Again, that kind of thing. So I had a marijuana-only law practice, and then Michigan passed the medical marijuana law in 2008, and I was lucky in addition, I wasn't involved in writing it, but there were so many things that were litigated in that over a decade, from its set up as a patient and caregiver system, and 5 years later, in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that a caregiver could sell only to their patient, but meanwhile, we had this whole gray market caregiver system that had grown up. I want to speak about other organizations just for a minute. So I've been lucky enough to follow this through and develop a practice. But after I was already in practice for 10 or 15 years, I learned that there's a committee called the Normal Legal Committee. Normal, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, is 40 or so years old. Keith Stropp founded it. He's still active and involved, now legal counsel for the organization. And Normal grew out of the first legalization organizations. Now there are quite a number that are all doing great work. But I learned that Normal had a legal committee, and they had conferences, and I began attending those conferences where there was it was mostly about criminal defense in those days. And for us in Michigan, where very little mass transit, there are traffic stops and there are search warrants are the two primary ways the cases begin. And so I developed a lot of knowledge in that area and have tried a lot of cases, including murder cases in Detroit and other matters throughout Michigan. But I was lucky enough to specialize in marijuana. I just want to mention, and now I'm the director of Michigan Normal, the statewide chapter, and there is the Motor City Normal chapter, and we have monthly now Zoom meetings. But I would encourage all of you, if you're interested in drug policy reform, to seek out other organizations. Margeaux mentioned Women Grow earlier, but the National Cannabis Industries Association is not a straight legal organization. The National Lawyers Guild is a bunch of lefty lawyers who are down with ending prohibition and mass incarceration and all of that. And if you haven't heard of the National Lawyers Guild, I'd encourage you to seek them out. There are a lot of marijuana business conferences I've attended every year. So I've been to Vegas like 10 years in a row for these marijuana conferences, which have grown from one small ballroom to most of the Las Vegas Convention Center now. And I'm sure it'll be downsized this year, but those are the Marijuana Biz, MJ Biz conferences. And there's other conferences and events. There was something every month or every couple of weeks before COVID hit. And the last thing I want to say is I'm on the board. I'm a founding member of the International Cannabis Bar Association, and you can join. It's INCBA. And we are building chapters throughout the world in order to, even when we have accomplished legalization here in the United States, to be able to broaden it to other countries. Marijuana is legal in some other countries and quasi-legal in others. So anyway, thank you all very much. That was a real long-winded introduction, but I'm Matthew Abel. I'm here in Detroit, Michigan, and I wish you all well.
That was such a robust introduction from these two speakers. So much knowledge to share across so many different dimensions. And I think a common thing that we picked up is changing the law. You've both been super involved in writing policy, in writing laws, and we got to get into that. But I think the place to start is to talk about, why do these laws exist? I mean, let's go back 10,000 years to talk about humans have used this plant forever. And how do we get to this point where you've got Mr. Abel being busted for cannabis in Michigan, and I mean, perhaps more to the point, we've got mass incarceration and just generations and generations of people suffering from this prohibition, which has always been selectively aimed at minority communities. It was first Mexican immigrants in America, it was the communists, it was the foreigners, and then it was Black Americans who were targeted by these laws. So I think it's really important to explore a little bit for a moment this historical context, going back really far in history, to expose this war on drugs that we're still living its effects, to expose it as an agenda-driven and a race-based failure. So I just want to make a couple quick notes about the human use of this plant going back in time. I mean, we see the first medical references to cannabis happening in China in 3000 BC. It's been known as a medicinal plant for all of human history. It figures prominently in the shamanistic traditions of many indigenous culture. And it was introduced into the New World, and it was used by everyone in America up until something very strange happened kind of at the turn of the 20th century. So I think this is kind of where I want to start our conversation about the beginning of cannabis laws in America, the beginning of prohibition. And I kind of want to just turn it over to our panelists now to talk about what happened at the turn of the 20th century. Why did we all of a sudden decide as humans that this beautiful plant that we had known for so long was something that we had to criminalize? So who wants to kind of pick up the story there?
Either way, Margeaux, or I can.
I'll match a start with that.
So here in Detroit, there's a building about 3 or 4 blocks from my office that has a stone engraved name over the door, and it says Park Davis. Park Davis was a drug manufacturer, and in its heyday in the early 1900s in Detroit, had a complex of acres of brick buildings. And in some of those brick buildings, they were taking cannabis or hemp and making liquids, cannabis sativa. At this point, I should flash a shot of the label that says Park Davis, cannabis indica, poison, so those were manufactured. We had a robust marijuana industry up to the late 1920s. And at that point, alcohol prohibition was ending. And there was a confluence of factors that caused marijuana to become illegal. Not the least of which was they were looking for something else to spend the law enforcement dollars on. But there were also some economic factors at play. There were 3 major industries that all had interest in seeing marijuana made illegal. They were the paper industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the plastics. The plastics or DuPont had just invented nylon, and hemp was used for hemp rope up until that time when nylon was invented and other types of rope were developed. So DuPont didn't want the competition from hemp with their new nylon product. And paper, well, I'll get to paper in a minute. The drug thing is fairly obvious, I think. Cannabis works for a lot of ailments, and the pharmaceutical companies would rather sell you something else, but they actually were selling cannabis medicines. So there was that. And the paper industry. Interestingly, William Randolph Hearst, who owned the San Francisco Herald Examiner, owned the forests and was selling the paper from his forests, selling the trees to his paper mill, to the newspaper and printing that. So he had an interest personally in keeping hemp illegal, or making it illegal, sorry, because the reason why hemp wasn't a problem up till that point is because there was an inventor who had just invented a device called a decorticator, and that decorticator was able to strip the long sinews of the hemp plant from the other chaff, if you will, including the flowers apparently, where they were going for the fibers of it. And it was much easier to process, especially into textiles, but also apparently, well, rope certainly, that's a textile, I guess. And so that machine had just been invented and they made marijuana illegal. And there's a guy named Harry Anslinger who had been head of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Or maybe he was made that, they created that new bureau. And Anslinger, in cahoots with William Randolph Hearst, cooked up a story that there were violent outbursts happening that I don't remember the exact issue, but there was all kind of propaganda that I'm not going to repeat that was super hostile and racist, and that so they printed these fabricated stories, talk about fake news, and printed it on the front page of the San Francisco Herald Examiner, which Harry Anslinger then took to Congress and held that newspaper up in front of Congress and said, marijuana is this demon drug and we need to make it illegal. So the interesting part of the whole congressional issue is that when they called it marijuana, it was an unknown substance. But if they had disclosed that this was hemp, it never would have passed Congress because there were too many hemp businesses that were producing medicine and textiles and paper and other things. And so it was passed by fraud, and then eventually Congress passed in 1970 under Richard Nixon, the new, I forget the name of the act, but, and Nixon was heard in tapes that were disclosed later saying that, you know, he was out to get the liberals, basically. So that's my brief introduction.
Yes, and picking up off where Matt left, I think that just framing cannabis as an illicit substance as opposed to the medicine that people had typically known it as was one factor. And it just as an extension of Jim Crow law, creating a law that allows you to ensnarl a particular group of people and criminalize that particular group of people. And that exists even up into the present tense.
I think that's great to point out that it is this fraud. It is this example of fake news, and it is the way that cannabis laws have developed. As we've articulated, is as a tool to be used against certain communities. I mean, we talked about how it was a tool against the counterculture. It was a tool against people that certain powerful politicians didn't like. So we talked about this 1970. This is the Controlled Substances Act, right? And then kind of maybe moving a little bit forward into the future, there are all these crime bills. The war on drugs escalates throughout the 80s into the 90s, and maybe another place to go next is the 1994 crime bill. And let's talk a little bit about perhaps the worst parts of prohibition when we get federal mandatory minimum sentences for low-level offenses. So maybe let's pick up the conversation a little bit there and talk about how prohibition got so bad.
Well, not just prohibition. I think it's important to note that when discussion of cannabis, that cannabis is a Schedule I federally prohibited substance, and cocaine is a Schedule II. So basically, based on that scale, it says that, you know, there is a less likelihood for medicinal use and a greater chance of addiction and or abuse of this particular drug. So when you talk about the crime bill, you're taking the group of people that we've already targeted and identified, you know, as somewhat low-hanging fruit. That's one of the main things that an officer can pull you over for. Say that I smell the odor of cannabis, and that leads to a number of things. But now we see, you know, this escalating to a whole new level where cannabis is being not only prosecuted, but being prosecuted much more harshly than some other substances. And now we're in a place where we have legalization, and we're looking back and saying, you know, there were communities that were disproportionately impacted. But I think it's relatively hard to garner how those communities were disproportionately impacted. Looking only at arrest, it literally destroyed the fabric of communities to impose these type of laws.
I think that's a great point, Margeaux. So we've talked about prohibition, we've talked about some of its pernicious effects, and now let's move into a discussion about how did legalization come about. I mean, as you just said, Margeaux, there are so many pernicious effects that are not just arrest rates, and I think it's important to point out that early legalization measures didn't really take this into account. It's only recently, I think, that the conversation has started to turn toward social equity and trying to right some of these wrongs. So let's get a little bit of background on early legalization. What did that look like? Both of you have mentioned this compassionate caregiver model. My understanding is that model, it allowed patients access to cannabis. Matt talked about how, though, that different state Supreme Courts have said that only one caregiver can grow for one patient. It creates this kind of legal gray area. I think a lot of states that legalized early, they were left with a gray area. There were proto-dispensary types where people could maybe walk into a buyer's cooperative and get their cannabis, but it wasn't a really functional model. So let's talk a little bit about that, those early legalization states. How did that look? And, you know, how is that different than what we have today with sophisticated seed to sale, statutory and regulatory schemes? Yeah, so let's talk about those early measures.
Well, August, let me correct the misimpression I left. A caregiver in Michigan could have 5 patients, not just one. So they could grow for themselves and 5 other people. And here in Michigan, it's 12 plants per person. And the legalization initiative allows the same number because we didn't want patients to be targeted if they had more than what somebody might think was legal. And so, but with legalization, excuse me, there's a maximum of 5 plants per household, except if there are medical cards involved. So not every state has home growing. And, you know, there's been a huge gray market and illegal market in cannabis forever, as long as it's been illegal. In Michigan, we set the tax level pretty low comparatively. There's a 10% excise tax, which medical marijuana patients do not have to pay, people who have a card. And there's a 6% sales tax, which the patients do have to pay. But that's not an excessive tax when in some other states there are 20 or 30% taxes at the production level when it's leaving a grow or a processor. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of people on the left of me, and I'm pretty far left, but people who are saying that, or maybe they're all the way around to the right, that it should be sold like tomatoes and there shouldn't be any tax or any regulation and get the government off our backs. And that would be great, but I live in the real world and I'm not sure. I mean, I think we're a long way from that. So the rub right now is that if you do not have a commercial license, it still is a felony to sell marijuana to someone else in Michigan. So, you know, we got legalization for possession and we got it to be able to give it away to people, to gift it without remuneration. But you know, there are, well, I was saying that we had a gray market system that developed with dispensaries because people needed other products and it just works better not to have one person have to supply 5 people steadily with anything they possibly might want. And so we had these gray market dispensaries that grew up. And when the licensing began, the state of Michigan cut all the gray market, they were going to close them all down. And there was a hue and cry from the patient community who had finally found a place to get the tincture or the rub or the concentrate that they needed and were about to lose that supply. And the state backed off, even though the Supreme Court had said that a caregiver may only provide it to their 5 patients, sell, give, whatever. And so we had a system other than that, and we're still actually phasing out of that. Earlier this year, the state said that the stores could no longer buy from caregivers, but they've allowed the growers and the processors to continue to buy from caregivers as long as that product now is fully tested and passes. And that is being cut off at the end of September. October 1st, no more caregiver product will go into the Michigan regulated system under it's called Metric, METRC, and it's a piece of software that is seed to sale tracking. Most people, FYI, go with a secondary system like Trees or BioTrack or Akerna, which was MJ Freeway, which allows them, FlowHub is one, that allows them more flexibility in tracking their product. But in this regulated market where most of my work now, and our law firm has 5 attorneys, and 10 years ago we were all doing criminal defense work. One of them was still a law clerk, but and he's the only one who does any criminal defense work now. And the rest of us all do entirely business licensing mostly, and litigation now as well. We're suing a municipality over a license denial, and we have a piece of litigation going over a real estate deal. So it's interesting because I was lucky enough, as I said, I attended these normal legal seminars and met marijuana lawyers from all around the country. And sitting there, it occurred to me, I can do this full time. And I just did. And it's one of my good friends is a lawyer in Colorado, and they're 5 years ahead of us out there. So we know where everything is going. Right now, we're still building out our infrastructure and our licensing system. And within 5 or 10 years, it'll all be fully built out. Every community that's going to allow a license will have done so. And all of the places will have been built, and the prices will have come and gone several times. It's really interesting economically with supply and demand issues because it's such a rapidly moving field right now. So,
Yeah, so Matt, you're talking a lot about regulation right now and licensing, and that's a really big area for practitioners in many different states. And so on that note, I kind of want to turn the conversation over to Margeaux right now and talk a little bit about ways that the way states regulate cannabis are changing. We talked about how states like Michigan, they started with this medical use program. And I think it seems to me right now that they're rethinking the regulatory scheme. They're talking about social equity. I mean, maybe Michigan's not doing it as well as states like Illinois. But like Matt said, there's licensing opportunities opening up now. And it really seems to me that this is, in a way, a second wave of legalization. There was that initial medical push, and now people are kind of rethinking that, saying, how can we do this better? What did we leave out the first time? And I think a big part of that are these social equity programs that states are attempting to set up with varying degrees of success. So talk a little bit about how legalization is changing.
Well, one thing I want to say about social equity is that, it's important to define it because it means something different to different people and they have different expectations. But at the root of all of this is an acknowledgement that there were communities that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And that was a byproduct of systematic racism. But I think it's important to always defer to the systematic portion because it is a system. And so when you create one piece of policy in any particular state, or even one social equity policy in a multitude of states, it's like an inchworm approach, because it does take us a little bit closer to some forms of economic empowerment. But at the same time, it's a web, and you're just snipping one string in that web. So social equity means different things in different places. Different states took different approaches to social equity. In the state of Michigan, our caregiver compassion system was very low entry point. There was not a high dollar amount for people to participate in that program. And then we brought on the MMFLA, the Medical Marijuana Facilities and Licensing Act, which enacted a seed to sale system. And that system raised the bar considerably in that you had to have capitalization requirements, you had to have seasoned money, a number of factors that are rooted in economic empowerment that was making it still inaccessible to a number of communities. In addition to that, the way that the initial law was written is that you could not have any criminal conviction. You couldn't have a criminal conviction and be a bud tender under our medical program. And then we realized that, the industry was evolving. The state of Michigan did enact social equity in our adult use program. And there were still a number of complexities in that adoption in our adult use. One is that in order to participate in a number of the license structure for adult use, you had to have been previously licensed in medical. So it still eliminated, large groups of people. And then we adopted a social equity program that, number one, is not funded. Any program that is a public works program that is not funded, you would not expect to have great success outcomes. If I said there are low test scores and I want to raise test scores and I don't give you $1 to raise test scores, then you won't see, a great increase there. And we did not see a large number of participation in social equity for a multitude of reasons in our adult use program. One being, as part of the campaign was at odds with the NAACP. The NAACP was in opposition to legalization. And there came a number of marketing attempts surrounding that confused people about what this was. There was a slogan that said, "This is crack weed, this is a return to crack epidemic," and most people did not understand that there's no intrinsic difference between what is medical marijuana and essentially adult use, other than who can consume it. And the tax rate are pretty much the differences. Do you need a medical marijuana card saying that you've been certified or approved by a physician, or do you just need an adult saying that you're 21 years of age? But there's nothing intrinsically different about the product itself. So there was some confusion about that. Like, was there a difference between medical marijuana and adult use? The city of Detroit has extremely high auto insurance rates, and so they told people are going to be driving around, they're going to be impaired, they're going to have car accidents, it's going to make your car insurance go up. So a lot of the fear and lack of information that has fed into all other facets of oppression in this particular industry played a part there as well. And so there was no collective group of people that said, this is what we want as part of social equity, or this is what social equity should look like. And even to this day, a number of residents in a number of municipalities that were approved as social equity cities have still not fully adopted the adult use program, because there's a lot of discussion and debate around historic distribution of wealth, distribution of information that plagues a number of these programs. The state of Illinois was a little bit more forward thinking. They enacted a different structure that allowed the larger operators, the MSOs, the multi-state operators, to go first essentially and to use tax revenue to fund the social equity applicants. And that is a process that is in play right now. There have been some delays in the state of Illinois due to COVID. And they announced the most recent lottery winners. There were 21 groups that essentially have access to 75 licenses, but there has been discussion of some potential corruption in that particular program as well that is now hindering installing that program. I also extended and did some pro bono work in the city of Los Angeles more recently with a group that was amazing. They were, much more savvy than most people who are starting off in this industry, but they had extremely large holding costs for a very long period of time as they proceeded through the process, which can be very, rigorous and slow sometimes. And then the social equity applicants were offered an opportunity to do something called suppression of their application. Essentially, it's almost like ticket scalping, where I take a very large digital application and I compress it into a very small application, which allows it to go through the portal more quickly. And it was a first come, first serve 100 round license for phase 3 applicants in the city of Los Angeles. When presented, they were offered the opportunity to do that for a fee of $25,000. And a number of social equity applicants said, no, we want to follow the rules. We don't want to cheat. We have great application. We've got, plans, and we're going to just trust the process. And they trusted the process, and a lot of people came up short. And they had a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles, which was then settled. And there was no wrongdoing on the part of Los Angeles, essentially. What it was a third-party services software platform that processed the applications that lobbyists and attorneys were able to approach. They suppressed the applications. Some people had trouble accessing the portal. Some people went through the process, and out of 100 licenses, one particular group got 13 or 14 of the first one. There was another 100-round license of the same type, and that same group got another batch of licenses, and I believe they have a total of 27 out of the 200. So some of the complexities when it comes to social equity are rooted in just the fabric of what is America historically, the interpretation of laws, the access to capital, the and redeem them. And it's been complicated in a number of places for that reason. I think that it's great that the cannabis industry is one of the first industries out to say, you know, we're going to try and rectify some of the historical harm that has happened. But these are people that are operating in the private sector. So it's very difficult to hold them to the same standard that you would a government entity or municipality that has actually done the over-policing and the criminalizing of these particular groups of people. So social equity is a step in the right direction for sure. And it's a conversation that is more relevant now more than any time, you know, in our history for quite some time. But I always, you know, hate to be, you know, the bearer of bad news, and that social equity in and of itself cannot do all of the heavy lifting. That is very important to know when it comes to social equity, that even when we put programs in place, there's not large scale participation all the time, just due to understanding. Our marijuana regulatory agency had a roadshow for social equity. And in order to be notified of the events, you had to be signed up on the MRA's website, which a number of people were not. They held a number of the meetings at 10 a.m. So if you're a person that's working, you may not be able to attend a daytime meeting about one of your potential entrepreneurial pursuits. And they did a great job of presenting what the laws were for the state of Michigan, what the fees were for the state of Michigan. But there was a little bit of complexity in that holding a license is almost like building a 7-layer cake. If I tell you the state license requirements, that's great, but there's still municipal requirements that you need to understand. You need to understand real estate. You need a CPA, you need an attorney, possibly a lobbyist. You need an architect. You need to understand access to capital, supply chain, compliance, security. So there were a number of factors that were beyond the scope of what the state could even really present to people in a very short period of time. And so I would attend the road show, and then I would talk to people outside, and I would say, well, you know, how much do you think it costs to get a license? And most people said they thought it cost around $40,000 or $50,000. And they were shocked to hear that it was, you know, it could be potentially 10 times that. So I think that some groups that can benefit from social equity in theory and in practice are coming to the understanding and the law a little bit later than others. And so there's a curve there. There's still a lack of understanding about how we're operating in state silos, and this is federally illegal. So there's some hesitance there. Am I breaking a federal law by participating in what appears to be a legal license structure in my state, whatever that state may be? So there are a number of complexities surrounding social equity that you have to take all of those into consideration in what is a good program. And what actually dictates what is a good program is participation. And we've had very low participation in the state of Michigan. I believe that there were 4,000 applications in Illinois by 700 unique groups, so that they've had exponentially more participation in their social equity program than we've seen in the state of Michigan.
This is great, Margeaux. So you've contrasted a couple different programs across states. You've talked a little bit about what works and what doesn't work, and what it means to have a robust social equity program that can get people excited and get them involved and get them the resources to actually participate. as kind of a follow-up to that, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what should a social equity program look like, particularly in these states that have not yet legalized. Even in a state like Missouri, for example, that went through this first medical licensing round, but didn't have a terrible amount in the way of social equity in that licensing round. What are some steps forward for states to address social equity? How can they make it happen? How can they actually get people involved in the industry? How much is it the actual regulatory scheme? What part does that play? What part does real criminal justice reform play? And I mean, do we need to reform employment laws too? You talked a little bit about how just being a bud tender is hard if you have any kind of prior record. So it's such a complex constellation of factors that need to come together for a program to work well in states. But what are maybe some things that states yet to legalize or yet to implement a robust social equity program? What should they be thinking about?
Number one, inviting people that were disproportionately impacted to the table very early on in the lawmaking process, not expecting them to interpret the laws that have already been set on their behalf, I would say is a huge factor. The goal of most social equity programs is economic empowerment for sure. And that is definitely the reason that most people enter into the cannabis industry in general. But access to information and funding are absolutely essential. I also think that community benefits is a huge part of it, because we talk about communities being destroyed, and putting some wealth into the hand of a very small group of people does not cover the community at large. So there has to be some consideration for the community at large. However, I think that social equity is essentially a partnership between licensees and people participating in the industry, whether it be through employment, hiring vendors, a number of things, and the actual government itself. Like, I think it's really interesting that the government is the one that created, the crime bill and all these other things. And then now all of the heavy lifting has been passed to the licensees, that they're expected to rectify, every atrocity that's happened since 1937, because it's not possible for an industry to do that in a silo. And these are independent operators who legally do not have to always, there's sometimes points and scoring systems, but if I write it in my application, are you going to actually hold me to that standard where someone's verifying my application and seeing, did I uphold the tenets that I established in my application and or my business plans? So it gets really complex, because I can game the system relatively easily when it comes to social equity by putting forth a social equity plan. I think what is really more important to look at is the impact that you created, because words committed to paper that do not transition into action are not social equity. So we're seeing a lot of different things when it comes to social equity, and we're having a lot of conversations amongst a lot of different groups of people about what this means and what this looks like, especially in a time when cannabis went from being illegal and a federally prohibited substance to an essential service. In many places, cannabis was deemed essential during the pandemic. So we've seen this industry, have a quantum leap during a year where most people expected to take the year off. So I think that social equity means a multitude of things, but it is not just conceptual. It actually has to be tangible.
Those are great words, Margeaux. I think let's have Matt jump in here. I think one thing that you can help us understand, Matt, is how does someone get a license? Margeaux talks about how complex it is. You have to have a lot of capital. You've got to have a CPA. You've got to have a lawyer. Maybe you could walk us through the process that you've done with a lot of people in Michigan. Is how do you go about getting that license? I think that's also interesting for our law students, for our apprentice lawyers here. What role does the lawyer play in getting this license, and why is it such a complex system? where do those complexities come from? It's all these regulations, right, that we have to comply with. So maybe talk a little bit about what are the specific challenges that people face when they're getting a license, and how is that different maybe for the different kinds and categories of licenses that people get?
Well, as for me, I find that I'm as much of a counselor as I am a lawyer. And as I tell the clients, they can do the paperwork themselves. You don't have to be an attorney to do it, but those who hire us want us to do it because we're familiar with it. We can do it more quickly. We just know the lay of the land. And generally, at our firm with 5 attorneys, I'm the lead lawyer. I'm the person most people know my name anyway. And so I generally do the initial consultations with the clients and try to get them to retain us, but I charge them $4.20 an hour for a consult, and they pay it. And cash, check, or charge, it doesn't matter to me. I've been audited by the IRS, so I mean, and you can't pay me in weed, but I do accept tips. I do have a testing laboratory down the end of the hall, and we can do a little amateur test on that stuff. I would probably am the first person to have a medical marijuana card in the state of Michigan. The card was issued on 4/20/09, believe it or not. It was the first day that cards were issued, and it's some random number. And so that's been fun. But when a client comes in, there are they don't generally realize how involved it is. But regardless, just quickly, the procedure is, the first step is pre-qualification. You can file as an individual, but most people form an LLC to go after growing, processing, or retail in medical. And there are also silos of transporting and lab testing. If you own one of those licenses, you can't have any share in any other type of a license. You can have multiple labs, you can have multiple transporters. And everything moved from a grower to a processor to a retailer has to move through the transporter, and it has to also be tested in between those steps. So the first process is to form a company and get it pre-qualified. In the beginning, and under medical marijuana, it was requiring 3 years of not only tax returns, but bank statements, credit card statements, all types of things. And there were capitalization requirements for each license that ran a minimum of $150,000 to a maximum of $500,000 for the largest grow. A provisioning center capitalization is $300,000. That's still in effect. Now, they never explained the purpose behind it, whether it was to keep poorer people out, whether it was to make sure that people had access to capital, so maybe they're less likely to commit a crime. I have no idea. But the capitalization is still there for medical, but there is no capitalization under the recreational law. I was lucky enough, I complained so much about the drafting of the medical marijuana law and the vagueness of parts of it, that, I mean, they wrote an outdoor grow is got to be enclosed on all sides but the base, which leaves no reference to the top. And it's still not a settled issue in Michigan as to whether an outdoor grow needs a top or not. God damn it, they could have just said it one way or the other, And I mean, I can argue it literally both ways. And when you can do that, it's vague, right? So that's been a problem. But you form your company, you get pre-qualified. Pre-qualification was in the beginning taking about 6 months. Now it's about 30 days. So once you've submitted all of the paperwork, and there's a $6,000 fee, but if someone qualifies for one of the social equity programs, and they've changed the eligibility a couple of times, there are now, I believe it's 184 communities where it applies. If you end up putting a facility in one of those communities, the discount is permanent. If you put the facility in a non-social equity community, you only get the discount for 2 years. And that can be, the discount is 10% if you've been a caregiver for at least 2 years, I don't know why, and maybe Margeaux does, why a caregiver is historically disadvantaged, but then there's, or economically, and then you get a 25% discount for being a 5-year resident of one of those communities, 5 of the last 10 years. In the beginning, that was the sole qualifier, beginning qualifier, and they've modified that. And the third one is having a criminal record. A misdemeanor is worth 25 points, a felony is worth 40 points. So the maximum discount would be 75 points for somebody who had a felony. Well, if they had a felony, drug felony, they're not going to be a caregiver. So 40 on the felony, 25 on the local community, 65% off that $6,000 pre-qualification fee. So you've got that. Then comes the hard part, which is finding a community which has passed an ordinance where you can find real estate that complies with the zoning and figure out a way to get it, and then get the clerk to sign an attestation that you're eligible for one of the licenses, and then submit architectural drawings and a full-blown business plan and everything that goes with it, including a waste disposal plan. And then you have to be ready for a walkthrough within 60 days because the state only has 90 days to approve or deny the license. So that's how you get, and then the day you get the license, you pay them the balance. Oh, and by the way, you're going to pay any community, the city, $5,000 per year per license. And then the licenses from the state range from $7,000 to $40,000 approximately. And under recreational or adult use, there are other licenses. There's a micro business that's 150 plants, all in one, grow it and sell it. There's a consumption lounge, which we haven't, consumption establishment, excuse me, we haven't seen any of those yet. Just a few communities have passed ordinances that allow them, and there will be temporary events. So to go back to Margeaux, I saw today there was a bill introduced in the legislature, I think it was a few weeks ago, but it would prohibit marijuana businesses from contributing to a nonprofit organization. So I was wondering if you were aware of that, and what the hell is my question?
No, I was not aware of that, because that kind of contradicts the concept of social equity, because a lot of nonprofit grassroots organizations actually do the work. Like, that's quite a climb to run a vertical operation and actually be the person that's always hands-on doing the impact work. And I had not seen that, but this is a dance. Like we move forward, then we move back a couple steps. A couple of months ago, it was, should we allow people who have a spouse, who is an elected official, participate in the program? But at the end of the day, the state of Michigan, I believe Michigan and Alaska are the only 2 states that have full-scale legalization and no path to expungement. So we are seeing an evolution in the industry side of this, and a lot of tweaks, on the industry side of this. But I'm not sure that, in totality, that we're being as impactful as a lot of the conversation around legalization would lead most people to believe.
Right on.
Guys,
hopefully expungement. Hopefully expungement will move maybe in the lame duck session this year. So. And
not just expungement; it has to be automatic expungement. I mean, I agree. I have seen the models from Code for America and the Clear My Record software, and outside of being just surprisingly easy, it is extremely cheap to do automatic expungements. If the numbers are correct, I believe Dorchester, Massachusetts has a population of roughly 87,000 people, and it was $15,000 to do automatic expungements for marijuana for everyone in Dorchester, Massachusetts. You saw the state of Illinois doing automatic expungements on January 1st of this year. It was really low-level possession. I believe you had to have less than 3.5 grams to qualify for that automatic expungement. You've seen it happen in San Francisco. So individual municipalities are taking this to task. but it is really, really important at a state level that we start to see automatic expungements, because there's so many people that are disenfranchised for very, very minor offenses, and have been disenfranchised for quite some time from housing, employment, and education, who have no intentions of pursuing a license or being part of the seed to sale market, who do deserve some relief, in that we have full scale legalization. They can walk into a store and purchase it, but they might not be able to turn in an application or a resume because of the previous convictions that are on their records.
I agree.
Margaret, that's a great point about expungements, and I think that's something that we here at SLU hope to focus on a little bit this semester as kind of a service outreach opportunity. And guys, this has been just a fantastic discussion. We've been through roughly 10,000 years of history. We've talked about opportunities for the future, paths forward, and I do hate to cut our discussion off, but I think we should do that now. And I do want to open the floor up to any students that have got questions, and want to tap into the resource that is in front of them right now. Two experts that could each talk all day about their exciting careers, the things they work on. So do we have questions queued up? Randall? I think we had a few questions. We're going to get those to our panelists.
Hi there, guys. Thanks so much for coming. I do have one question here written down that I was curious if you guys, as professionals, have faced any negative reactions from either other lawyers or other professionals for being involved in the cannabis industry, and just sort of, how you've dealt with that, if it affected you at all, or if you're able to move past it pretty easily. If you could just talk about that.
The one person I was worried about telling was my mother, and she's the most judgmental person that I know. So once I got over that hurdle, I don't think a lot of other opinions really mattered. The only time I had like a really unusual reaction, it actually was in an attorney's office of all places, ironically. I did an event a few years back, related to cannabis for Detroit Startup Week. And one of the recommendations was that we go and we watch this deal incubator. I was at the Hirschram deal incubator, Matt, in Bloomfield. And there was a gentleman who was presenting, and he had a really unique idea for an aquaponic system that would have been married to our caregiver system. And part of the deal incubator is that people pitch their ideas, and you ask them questions, and you ask them to consider other factors. It just helps them strengthen their business plan. And I was the market leader for Women Grow, and we had not yet adopted the MMFLA, but I asked him, was he aware that the MMFLA existed, or that it was coming, and that there was going to be a shift essentially in the industry in Michigan. And there was a gentleman at the end of the table who jumped up, and he was like, "You can't come in here and you can't talk about that." He's like, "This is federally illegal and I won't tolerate it." And he stormed out the room. And I was like, well, that's weird. And then after the guy presented, the presenter came and he sat next to me because he did not know about the MMFLA, and he was curious as to, what changes were happening. And the gentleman came back into the room, and he walked straight past the guy who said he had been growing since 1987, and came to me and said, this is federally illegal. You can't come in here. You can't talk about this. And I asked him, why could I not talk about laws in the state of Michigan? And he said, because you can't. And I said, well, I haven't done anything that violates any federal agreement. Like, I haven't told anyone how to break any laws, or I haven't talked about diversion to other states, or, granting access to minors. And he was really livid that I knew the law in that intricate detail. And so he said, well, how would you feel if, because he claimed that he worked with and for the FBI. He said, how would you like it if I had someone arrest you? And I said, arrest me for what? I don't have any cannabis on my possession. I don't have any cannabis in my car unless you just went outside and put it there. I'm a qualified registered patient in the state of Michigan. I don't have a possession limit that is over and beyond what I am allowed to have in my home. And he's like, well, I will just throw you in jail and investigate your background. And then he said, the only reason I'm not going to arrest you is because I don't want to embarrass Kevin. That's the attorney whose office we were in. But I was in the presence of many attorneys, and no one said, you know, what she's doing is not breaking the law. No one said, you know, you can't talk to her that way, or, you know, this doesn't make sense. And so it really honestly had the opposite reaction. Like I really felt that his approach to me was based on racial lines for sure, and not actual actions, because I don't physically grow cannabis, and the guy sitting right next to me did grow cannabis, and he was not getting any, you know, any of this grief from this guy, but it actually really fueled me in the opposite direction. Like, if he was that upset about me having information, that I was going to consume even more information, and I was going to do even more than you ever would have anticipated me doing before. So, I mean, sometimes it has an opposite effect, but in most places, I don't. Like, I've been to AARP meetings. I've done a lot of events in Black churches. I've done some really tough crowds. And I can't say that I've ever gotten, you know, a really harsh response other than that one time.
Matt, did you have anything to add?
That was a really great story, Margeaux. And I forgot what the question was, though.
Has you
seems
had
like
any adverse reactions to being in this industry?
So when I first became a marijuana lawyer, I had these cards printed that had indica and sativa leaves on them, because marijuana is defined under Michigan law as cannabis sativa L. So I used to tell the prosecutor they'd have to prove that it wasn't indica, and just because it turned purple on a field test, etc. But aside from that, it was pretty racy for me to have a marijuana leaf on my card 15 years ago. And I used to actually whisper to people that I was a marijuana lawyer. You know, it's funny because I didn't even feel comfortable saying it out loud. I completely do now, and I don't give a damn, you know. People see the stores and it's like, yeah, we participated in that, you know, and yeah, I worked to legalize it and all that. So, and Margeaux did too, and we all, you know, we're all in this together. But now it's interesting because I get more positive reactions than someone might suspect. You know, really 60% of the people, I think the vote for legalization on medical was 57%. And I think legalization ended up being 63%, if I'm not mistaken, but might have been lower. But the point is, the majority of people do support legal marijuana. So I once wrote an article for a magazine called I Don't Really Smoke, because it occurred to me, first of all, I'm the director of Michigan Normal. I tell people that, they probably figure I smoke, you know, and if not, I tell them I smoked since I was 15. And, but I wrote this column called I Don't Really Smoke, because when I tell people what I do and they go, oh, that's interesting, and I'll say, do you smoke weed or do you smoke marijuana? When somebody says some people just say yes, and some people just say no, but some people say, I don't really smoke. And that cracks me up, because the people who say, I don't really smoke, they do smoke. If they didn't smoke, they'd say, I don't smoke, not I don't really smoke. And so I've learned, and now more than, especially during COVID, but and maybe it's just my age group and that, but a lot of people who I talk to say, you know, I don't smoke, but if you have a gummy, I'll take one of those. And so, in fact, I am doing a lot more edibles. I've been wiped out on edibles. Be careful if you don't know the dosage. Thankfully, we have licensed, regulated stores where the product is dosed and you know how many milligrams is in a 5 milligram blueberry chocolate covered, or a 5 or 10 milligram mango flavored gummy, or something like that, and you can titrate it, you know. So now I know, you know, I don't want to do more than 25 milligrams. Really, that's plenty, and sometimes it's too much. And so anyway, people are pretty cool with it. People are pretty cool with it now. I'm a member of a club where they have a cigar bar, and the guy who runs the cigar bar, I said, you know, I'm just going to go in and stink it up with weed. And he's like, as long as you don't make a mess, I'm all right with that. So.
One more thing, Matt. Last year I did an event at the Jewish Community Center to explain adult use legalization. And 2 weeks before I was scheduled to come, they called and they asked me if I was going to bring edibles. And I was like, no, you know, I'm just here with information. You know, I'm not going to have any product on my person. And I go and I show up, and the first thing they asked me is, did you bring the edibles? And I was like, no, you know, I was pretty clear that I was not bringing edibles, and I do not have any edibles. And it's like a room full of like people that are, you know, maybe over 70, and you still like an audible, like, oh, like in disappointment that I shut up with only information and no product. I did give them a lot of information. They did rate me well as a speaker. We're quite disappointed. And it will surprise you, you know, amongst some of the groups that are actually interested in different forms of consumption, and people who don't understand that, you know, topicals and, you know, things that are absorbed different ways into your body cause completely different reactions. If you smoke, or if you eat an edible, or if you use a tincture, or if you use a topical, you're going to have completely different reactions amongst all those different forms. So sometimes it's more often the opposite. It's not that they're angry or upset or put off that I'm in the industry. It's that they're disappointed that I'm in the industry and I'm not constantly carrying flower and or edibles. So.
I've had that happen to me too, but
Yes.
I tell them I'm not a grower, you know.
Yes.
You know, this culture shift is just fantastic to hear. I mean, 15 years ago, you can't have a leaf on your business card, and next thing you know, you walk into a room and people are begging for handouts. And you know, if no one else participants have questions, I kind of wanted to follow up on that, and maybe both of you, Matt and Margeaux, can talk about, you know, from your perspective, giving advice to these young law students on the call today. It seems like it's not a bad idea to brand yourself as a weed lawyer these days, as someone who's interested in the cannabis industry. So I don't know, maybe talk a little bit about advice you have for students that are getting ready to enter the workforce in a couple of years here, and you know, what are career opportunities we should be looking at? What are ways we can brand ourselves as experts in this industry? And we've got our resource page here up now with some different informative links, but I mean, maybe what are some more ways just to get educated, to get to know this industry, and to start building an expertise, something that you couldn't do clearly 10 years ago, but nowadays it's cool. I mean, even the seniors are into it.
Well,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead, Margeaux.
I think it's really important to network. This is a relatively new industry where everything's not always committed to paper. Sometimes it's just discussion or being in the right room at the right time. Also, I would study the historically what cannabis has been, but for the future, I would definitely look at California. I think that California is probably like 10 years ahead of us. I think that there's a lot of big data around cannabis that exists right now that did not exist before in the form of analytics. And I think that the next step for this industry is going to be interstate commerce. And so I would pay particular attention to current interstate commerce laws for other commodities, and whatever new conversation evolves around that model for cannabis.
So my suggestion is that, you know, it used to be the only work in cannabis was criminal defense, but now there are a wide variety of types of law, and people are specializing in, I am kind of a general practitioner in cannabis law, if you will, but, and luckily I have a pretty good real estate background, and one of my partners worked at a business incubator for several years and has a pretty good background in that, and we have someone who's of counsel who does intellectual property, and I know a couple of good marijuana tax lawyers. Because each of these are areas of specialty, at least until it's federally legal. Things I just jotted down: real estate, mergers and acquisitions, banking, corporate and business, I guess that's part of the M&A stuff, tax law, intellectual property, products liability, and then they cover all the same employment and labor issues and generally accepted business practices, fair labor practices. And so, you know, do something you love. I'm a little OCD or whatever that I can, or hyperactive, that there's enough variety for me to keep me interested, that I'm not reading the same mortgage document day after day. I'm not taking, you know, a deposition of a case that's going on for years and years, although some of ours might. And we're now doing civil litigation. My friend who's a lawyer in front of me said it goes from criminal defense involving patients and caregivers to rudimentary business law and real estate and more sophisticated business law and tax law and banking and intellectual property, and then to litigation over mergers and acquisitions and real estate. And I tell clients, you know, don't get too emotionally attached to your business, because the way the supply and demand is, somebody could offer you $5 million tomorrow for a operating business. And if you don't take it, the market floods in the next year and they come back a year later and they're only willing to offer you a small bit of that. And so you have to be flexible. And I think a lot of companies are going to be acquired 2 or 3 times in the next 5 or 10 years as the multi-state operators build up. And there won't be all that many mom and pops in the end, because they're going to get bought out by multi-state operators. And so I think the trick is not to not get bought out, because sometimes that's the only economic reality of it. You can't produce things in volume at scale at the price that a competitor can, and they'll drive you out of business. So when you sell your company, you keep a share of the larger company, you know, sell it, but keep 10%. And when they merge again, your 10% becomes 1%. But I'd rather have a 1% of a multi-state operator and just go with it. So have fun. And, you know, you might make more money in the stock market than practicing law. That's the other thing. If you look at the marijuana stocks, they're in the dumps right now, which means it's really a good time, if you have any kind of money, to buy a little bit of those. Some of those stocks are a couple bucks a share.
Oh no, we're getting into day trading advice. This must mean it's time to call the event.
No, and I would say it's not day trading, because if you buy them, you want to be prepared to sit on them until legalization happens, and that's when the value will go up.
Matt, this is such great advice from both our panelists, and really useful things to think about for our law students. And I've seen our numbers drop off a little bit on the Zoom call, and I think that it's probably about time to let people go and to thank them for sitting through what's been a fantastic event. And if anything has raised more questions than it's answered, it gives us a lot of fertile things to explore for the Cannabis Law Society for the rest of the semester. I mean, we could have an event on each of those practice areas that Matt just talked about. and I think we will. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank so much both of our panelists, Matt and Margeaux. It was very generous of you to share your time with us today, to call in. And I think one of the great things, honestly, about COVID, maybe one of the silver linings, is that we can have people from Michigan, these experts, Zoom in and talk to us and share our knowledge. And it's great to be interconnected with people. And I just thank you so much for giving up your time and your expertise. And I learned a lot, and I hope that everyone else did too. And there's so much more to explore. So thank you everyone for tuning in to the Cannabis Law Society. We hope to see you again soon. And let's thank our panelists. Get a little, people are saying on the screen, but give them some snaps. This was great. Thanks for coming in, guys.
Thank you, August.
Thank you.